Hello everyone. Today we will be covering chapter 23, which is on chaining. Please excuse my voice as I am a little bit under the weather, but I will do my best to get through today's lecture as clearly, with my voice being as clear as possible. So to start off, within today's lecture, we will be covering items G9 and G13 from the 6th edition BCABA task list, or TCO. Those items will correspond with developing and implementing chaining procedures, and then develop and implement acquisition procedures that are appropriate to the client's skills and intervention goals. These will be done within discrete trial, free operant, and naturalistic teaching arrangements. So we're going to look at some different sets of complex responses. And I'll just show them to you first, and then we can talk a little bit more about what they are. So in this video, there is a man with a t-shirt. He is spreading the t-shirt on, a school shirt, you could say. He spreads the shirt on the table, and then he grabs it at very specific areas within, he places his hands in very specific areas. He maneuvers the shirt in a specific way, and then the shirt is all of a sudden folded. Okay, then here we have a man trying to put money inside of the vending machine in order to, get an item out of the vending machine. Next, we have someone washing their hands in a very specific manner, typically seen, we typically see surgeons wash their hands in this way, doctors, nurses, etc. And in this last clip, you will see someone tying a shoe. Again, in a very specific manner. So these are all complex chains of behavior, okay? And let's talk about what behavior chains are and why they are important. Okay, so what is a behavior chain? A behavior chain is a sequence of responses in which each response produces a stimulus change. Okay, and the unique thing about behavior chains is that those different links or those different components or steps that make up the behavior chain, they each function, they have a dual function. Okay, so each step or each response is going to serve as the conditioned reinforcer for the previous response, and it's also going to serve as the SD for the next response. So I'll show you what that means, okay? So let's think about the behavior of shoe tying, right? The behavior of shoe tying is not a simple behavior. It's not just you engage in one response and that's it. It's really a set of responses that are occurring sequentially, okay? They're occurring one right after the other, in a close temporally, right? They're occurring very quickly, one after the other. And what happens is after one response occurs, that serves as reinforcement for that previous stimulus, but it also serves as a discriminative stimulus for the next response that's going to occur. Okay, so it's setting up the occasion for the next response to occur. So here is that example for you all. So let me actually use the pen. So we have our stimulus, which in this case would be the shoes, right? We see the shoes, and that sets the occasion for us to begin tying our shoes, okay? So that's the response. So the first response is we're going to cross our laces, okay? Once we cross our laces, that serves as a conditioned reinforcer, okay, for this response of crossing over the laces. Now that serves as a conditioned reinforcer, but that also serves as a discriminative stimulus right, for that next response. So now that sets the occasion for us to engage in the next response. So now that we've crossed over our laces, we can go ahead and loop the blue lace under the other lace. Now that we've completed that action, that serves as a conditioned reinforcer for this response, right? Seeing the completed action serves as a conditioned reinforcer And it also serves as an SD for the next response, okay? So it's setting the occasion for the next response in the chain. Now, once we engage in the next response in the chain, we'll see the completed action that results in that serves as a conditioned reinforcer for that response that you just engaged in, and also serves as the discriminative stimulus for the next response in the chain, and so on and so forth, until you finally complete all the steps and you get to the very last step. So once we get down here to the last step, this last step will result in a terminal reinforcer, okay, or reinforcement, right? Each one of these steps has resulted in conditioned reinforcement, but this final step will result in a terminal reinforcer that reinforces the entire chain of responses. And typically, this reinforcer is a more potent reinforcer than all of the other ones that have been received throughout the chain. So we can have behavior chains for many different behaviors. Like an example of many different behavior chains would be brushing your teeth. A lot of the different daily living tasks are considered behavior chains. So brushing your teeth would be considered a behavior chain. Anything you do when you're cooking or you're baking would be considered a behavior chain. Working in an assembly line would be considered a behavior chain. I don't know, getting an oil change, putting gas in your car, all of those are behavior chains, okay? They are a sequence of responses in which each response is producing a stimulus change, and those stimulus changes are functioning as conditioned reinforcement for that response, and then as a discriminative stimulus for the next response in the chain, right? Well, not only can we have traditional behavior chains, but we can also have behavior chains with a limited hold. You probably learned about limited holds when you were learning about schedules of reinforcement. But just in case you didn't, a limited hold is basically when you place an additional restriction or an additional parameter on the behavior that you are trying to teach. And that parameter is usually that you are requiring that the behavior be completed within a specific time frame. And if the behavior is completed within a specific time frame, then they can access reinforcement. But if their behavior is not completed within a specific time frame, then they cannot access reinforcement. Okay, so when we have a behavior chain with the limited hold, that basically means that we have a chain of behavior that needs to be completed within a specific time frame in order for the learner to be able to access reinforcement. And if you don't engage, or the learner does not engage in that the entire behavior chain during the specified time frame, then they won't get reinforcement. Okay, so this is good in the sense that with a traditional behavior chain, all you're focused on is performance, right? You, let's say, can teach a person to cook, right? But sometimes you want a person to cook and be efficient. You want them to be proficient. You want them to be quick. So maybe we can teach a person to, maybe I don't know, making lasagna might take a person 2 hours. But if we have a behavior chain with a limited hold, we might teach that person to make a lasagna, but within a specified time frame. This might be something that chefs do in a kitchen. Maybe that's like a specific requirement for chefs. I really don't know. But this condition or this extra parameter is seen naturally in the real world. So we see it sometimes, for example, in production lines. So in an assembly line or in a production line, employees might have a specific time frame within which they must complete, a specific task. That's an example of a behavior chain with a limited hold. They have to do. The task is not just a simple task, like it's not just one response. It's usually a sequence of responses that needs to be completed within a specific time frame in order for them to meet maybe a requirements for a bonus. If they aren't completing, the tasks, the behavior chain within a specific time frame, then maybe they don't qualify for a bonus. Another example is, I'm sure you've seen this. I'm sure you've come across this if you have done any online shopping. But personally, when I have done online shopping, I've come across some stores where they'll have like a limited time offer, and they'll tell you check out within the next 15 minutes in order to get X, Y, and Z discount. That's an example. If you do go through that entire process, that's an example of a behavior chain with a limited hold. You have to add the items to your, let's say they give you 15 minutes. You have to add the items to your cart within that time frame. You have to click on the little cart icon. You have to click on checkout. You have to input your card information. You have to input your name, your street address. All of these different responses are included in that chain, right? You have to engage in the entire sequence of responses before the 15 minutes is over. Finally, you check out, and then you can access the reinforcer of you can get the 10% off your order, or whatever it might be, that whatever the incentive might have been. So this is another example of behavior chain with a limited hold in the real world. Okay, so now that you know what a behavior chain is, let's talk about the procedures that we have within behavior analysis for teaching behavior chains. So in behavior analysis, we have a procedure called chaining. Well, chaining is really like the umbrella term. It's actually composed of different methods for teaching these skills. So chaining involves various methods for linking specific consequences of stimuli and responses to form new performances. And as I mentioned, it's a way for us to teach behavior chains. New behavior chains are taught to people for several reasons. You might teach behavior chains because you want a person to live a more adaptive life. You might want them to be able to engage in daily living skills, independent living skills. Maybe there's certain on-the-job requirements that you might want to teach an individual, and they involve complex behavior chains. Well, you can use chaining procedures for things like that. Or even in the classroom, there might be specific behavior chains that you want to teach. Really, in any aspect of a person's life, you might choose to teach a specific behavior. Well, then you'll use a behavior chain. Well, then you use a chaining procedure. You might also do this to add behaviors to an existing behavioral repertoire. A person might already have a specific skill in their skill set, but you want to expand on that a little bit. So you can use chaining procedures to do that or accomplish that. And you can build more intricate and adaptive repertoires as well. So how can we establish behavior chains? We can establish behavior chains by using, by breaking down those behavior chains into the small component skills that make up the behavior chain. Okay, so this whole process of breaking down those behavior chains and looking at the specific steps that are involved in the behavior chain, this is called task analysis or task analyzing a behavior chain. This simply means breaking down a complex task into smaller teachable units. Remember that picture that I showed you earlier with the shoe tying, and it broke down every single step? That's an example of a task analysis. It's where we take the entire behavior chain and we think about, how can I teach this in smaller teachable units? Okay. The product of a task analysis is a series of sequentially ordered steps or tasks. A task analysis is going to be individualized to your learners based on their ages, their skill level, and then their prior experience. So here is another example of a task analysis, or a TA, which I didn't mention earlier, but an abbreviation that we use in the field for task analyses or task analysis is TA. So you'll hear this term often, and you should be familiar with it if you plan on being in the field. Okay, so this is just an example of a task analysis. We have our different steps that make up the behavior chain. So this is a task analysis for hand washing, or a TA for hand washing, right? First, we turn on the water, then we put our hands in the water, then we pump soap, then we rub hands, then we rinse hands, then we turn off water, get paper towel, dry hands, throw away paper towel. Okay, this data sheet is telling us exactly the sequence of behaviors that our client must engage in for hand washing. And as I mentioned, TAs are going to be individualized to your learners. So the way that you set up a hand washing TA for one learner might look completely different for a different learner. The way you set up a TA for shoe tying might look very different because there's different adaptive methods of shoe tying. There are somewhat specific accommodations for people with mobility issues or mobility difficulties. And so the whole point that I'm trying to make is your TA is going to be individualized based off of your learners' specific needs, their specific limitations, their specific preferences, whatever it may be. It's not going to be a one size fits all. You're not going to, just come up with the steps one time for hand washing and think that that's going to work for every single one of your clients. Okay, so then how do we create a task analysis? And then also, how do we ensure that our task analysis is actually, helping us achieve what we would like to achieve? How do we validate our TAs? So the first step is to identify the sequence of steps or components that are required to complete the task efficiently. This is going to be pretty arbitrary, but generally speaking, you want to make sure that you are being as thorough with your steps as possible. Break down your steps into small, achievable goals and think of what's required for the learner to do step by step. Try to run the task analysis yourself, to complete the task analysis yourself. There shouldn't be any gaps or any missing steps. If you, let's say, I feel like I've seen this before, where you ask a person to make a peanut butter jelly sandwich and you tell them to give you all the steps. And people will usually say, okay, first step, put the bread on the plate. Second step, put the peanut butter on the bread. Third step, put the jelly on the bread. And then fourth step, put the breads together. And when you ask a person to carry out this task analysis, they're stuck on the first step because you never wrote down the first step as opening the bread. That was a critical step that was missed. And so now you can't complete the task. So you just want to make sure that when you're task analyzing a behavior chain, that you're being very thorough with the steps. Although sometimes it seems obvious to us what the steps are or what the steps should be, it won't always be that way for your learners. Maybe sometimes you're task analyzing things not for your client, but maybe you're task analyzing something for a therapist or for a teacher or for a caregiver. And so you want to make sure that you're being very thorough when you're coming up with the sequence of steps. You want it to be as similar to the behavior chain as possible. Okay, I already mentioned the importance of individualizing the steps to meet your client's needs. And then finally, you're going to, in order to be able to create the most accurate task analysis, there's certain things that you can do. So you can perform the task yourself. You can ask other people to perform the task. So you can ask two different competent individuals to perform the task, and then have your learner perform the task and see how they did. Or you can ask an expert to perform the task. You can also use trial and error. So you don't have to, as I mentioned, I think in the shaping lecture, the steps that you come up with don't have to be perfect. What we do in behavior analysis all of the time is not, when you come up with a program, we don't expect our programs to be perfect from the get-go, okay? As a behavior analyst, you're gonna create a program and you're gonna continue to monitor progress with that specific program, and you're gonna continue to tailor the program as you go. I like to say that my programs are live programs, meaning that it's not like I write the program and I never revisit the program ever again. Rather, I write the program and every single time I do a supervision, I'm continuing to assess whether a program needs to be modified. Maybe the verbiage needs to be changed. Maybe my prompting levels need to be changed. Something might need to be modified. And so the same applies for when you are task analyzing something. You can create your initial task analysis and then along the way say, you know what, I made a mistake here. I'm going to modify my step 4 because I was missing something. Or this isn't necessarily the order that the client completes the skill in, but the order that they complete the skill in is still appropriate. So what you can do is you can use trial and error, which is what I just described, to revise the steps as you go. And then that way you can ensure that you are individualizing your task analysis to meet your client's specific needs. Okay, so now that you have your task analysis, let's talk about what you do to basically collect baseline. Okay, how can we assess the level of independence with each skill for a particular learner? There are two ways to determine which components of the task analysis our learner can already perform independently. So our two ways to assess mastery level of a task analysis is to either do the single opportunity method or the multiple opportunity method. And I'll describe what each of these looks like, and I have some examples on the next two slides. Excuse me. And also, there are examples of this in your textbook, which you can find in figures 23.6 and 23.7. So the figure 23.6 from the textbook corresponds with the single opportunity method, and the figure 23.7 corresponds with the multiple opportunity method. And I'll show you a different example on the next few slides, but they're very similar to the ones in the textbook. Okay, so how do we assess the level of independence with each step? So we have our single opportunity method, and the single opportunity method is when we assess a learner's ability to perform each behavior in the task analysis in the correct sequence. Now, the unique thing about the single opportunity method is that we're going to give them the opportunity to engage in the entire behavior chain, but if they miss a step, then we stop assessing. We don't help them at all, okay? So I'll show you what that looks like. So here is a task analysis. This entire, let me get my highlighter. Okay. This entire list here is our task analysis for making chocolate milk, okay? And if we're using the single opportunity method, we're basically going to give the client the opportunity to engage in all of these responses, all of these behaviors, okay? If they can engage in all of them, wonderful. We would write for, I didn't mention the key. So a plus would mean that they got the step correct, and then a minus would mean that they got the step incorrect. And when we're conducting baseline, we don't prompt at all. We don't support the learner at all. We're only trying to see, it's like a test. You're trying to see, do they have this skill or do they not have this skill? So I'm only putting plus or minus. They either got it right or they did not get it right. When I'm assessing how a learner is performing with a particular skill during baseline, I will not be providing any support. Okay? Especially, well, for the single opportunity method. Okay, let's say that the learner could engage in all of the skills. I would write pluses all the way down. Okay, but that's not, and I'll just do a little arrow. Pretend that this isn't plus signs all the way down. That's assuming that the learner could engage in the entire behavior chain. But that's not realistic. And most of the time, when we assess a learner's ability to engage in an entire behavior chain, they can't engage in all of the responses. And that's usually why you decide to task analyze a behavior chain, and why you're choosing to target, that particular skill. Okay. So when we're doing the single opportunity method, basically we're still giving them the opportunity to engage in all of these different behaviors, but we stop where they stop. And then we no longer, continue to push or provide assistance or anything like that. So in this case, with on 3/4/2050, the learner was able to engage in the first two steps, but when it came to the third step, they were not able to engage in that response. So basically, all other responses get marked as incorrect. Okay, we don't provide assistance. So for this particular day, they got an 18% independence. The same applies for the third day. So the 15th. So on the 15th, they were able to engage in the first three behaviors, and then they were not able to continue. So the rest of the skills got marked as negative or minus, and so on. So we never provide assistance. Now let's look at the multiple opportunity method. So with the multiple opportunity method, we are going to let the learner, it's very similar, except we are going to let the learner show us how they can perform with each particular step in the task analysis. Whereas in the single opportunity method, if they couldn't do it, they couldn't do it. We didn't help them, right? If they stopped at one step, that's where they stopped. The rest got marked as they couldn't complete the skill. But with the multiple opportunity method, basically, if the learner can do the first step, we mark it as a plus. Now, let's say we get to the second step, the learner can't do it. Okay, I'll do it for them. And then that way they get the opportunity to practice step 3, and I can assess whether they can engage in step 3 or not. And in this case, they couldn't. So then I will complete that step for them, then allowing them to complete step 4. If they're not able to, again, I will complete it for them, which then gives them the opportunity to practice step 5. Okay. Oh, but look, they could do step 5. So we get to mark that independent. That now puts us at step 6. Can they do it or can they not do it? Oh, no, they couldn't do it. Let me go ahead and complete it for them, and so on and so forth. So they couldn't do step 7, so I completed it for them. They couldn't do step 8, so I completed it for them. They couldn't do step 9, so I completed it for them, and so on. And then I'm able to assess how they perform with each particular step. So this really allows us to very clearly see which steps in the task analysis are they able to consistently engage in, because maybe some of the steps are mastered, which we see often. We see many learners where they've mastered some parts of a behavior chain, but other parts they haven't mastered. And so this baseline method allows us to get a better picture for how a learner is performing with specific steps in the behavior chain. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are different chaining methods in behavior analysis. So in this lecture, we're going to cover the 4 chaining methods that we have. We have forward chaining, total task chaining, backward chaining, and backward chaining with leap aheads. So the first chaining procedure that we will be discussing is forward chaining. And remember, these different chaining procedures are methods that we have within behavior analysis to teach behavior chains, to help a learner acquire these particular skills, these complex set of skills that we're trying to teach. So with forward chaining, what we are doing is we're breaking down this complex set of behaviors or sequence of behaviors, okay? And we're only going to focus on teaching the learner to complete the first skill in the chain. Excuse me. So behaviors identified in the task analysis are taught in their natural occurring order. So we're going to teach everything from beginning to end, but we're going to teach things, step by step. So we're going to focus first on just teaching the first step. Once the learner can master the first step or has mastered the first step, they can engage in that skill independently. Reinforcement will be delivered. They don't have to engage in the entire sequence of behaviors to, complete the entire behavior chain. They only have to do the first step. If they can do the first step, reinforcement is provided, and then we will complete the rest of the chain for them. Okay, once they master step 1, we'll move on to teaching the learner to engage in steps 1 and 2 together. Okay, sequentially in the same correct order. If they can engage in steps 1 and 2, then reinforcement is provided. And again, they don't have to complete the rest of the steps in the sequence. Each succeeding step requires the cumulative performance of all the previous steps in the correct order. So what this means is, let's say that we are currently targeting step 4 in the chain. Well, then that means that we're not only expecting correct performance or independent performance with step 4, but we want to see that steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 are completed correctly and independently in order for us to deliver reinforcement. And then it kind of, you increase your progression. So as they master skill steps, then we start adding in the next step. So once they've mastered step 4, we work on step 5, which is not just step 5. We work on steps 1 through 5 together. Then we work on steps 1 through 6 together, and so on. So on the next slide, I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so here is that task analysis again for making chocolate milk, where we have steps 1 through 11. With forward chaining, we're going to work from the top down. We're going to teach skills from the beginning to the end or in their naturally occurring sequence, okay, as I mentioned earlier. So we are going to be teaching in this order, okay? So we'll first work on step 1. Then, and I'll use my pointer here. So we'll first work on step 1, which is go to the refrigerator. Once we see that the learner is independently going to the refrigerator, we provide reinforcement. Our next step is to work on steps 1 and 2, right? We're going to work on chaining these behaviors together. And what this does is it makes the goal more achievable for the learner. You're reducing the response effort for the learner, right? They're not expected to engage in all of these 11 responses, which is a complex set of behaviors. But instead, we're making it so easy for them to access reinforcement because they only have to engage in the first response initially, then in the first and the second response. Then once that's mastered, they have to engage in steps 1, 2, and 3, which is go to the refrigerator, open the refrigerator, and take out milk. Okay, and then the component about reinforcement is very important here. So as I mentioned, with forward chaining, you're not going to wait until the end, okay, of the entire behavior chain to deliver reinforcement, right? We're not delivering reinforcement here. Whoops, SR. We're not delivering reinforcement here. No, okay? We're going to deliver reinforcement at the specific step that we're targeting. So after they've engaged, let's say we're working on step 3. So after they've engaged in all 3 of these responses, okay, that's when we'll deliver the reinforcer. Okay, let me erase this. Okay, and then now let's say we're targeting step 4, right? Let's say that we've achieved mastery. I can't delete that one. That's okay though. Let's say that we've achieved mastery of steps 1 through 3. Now we're going to target steps 1 through 4, okay? And once they are doing that, then we'll deliver reinforcement here, okay? And now, what you might ask yourself, well, what about the rest of the sequence, right? What about steps 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11? If we're delivering reinforcement at step 4, what happens with the rest of the sequence? Well, this is going to vary based off of each practitioner. Some people might choose to stop here and just reinforce here. And then some practitioners will choose to complete the rest of the sequence themselves. So not the client, but the therapist themselves is going to complete the rest of the sequence to just maybe model for them. But really that's not required. You could stop at step 4 or at whatever step it is that you're working on. Okay, but the important part here is they're not going to contact the reinforcer for completing the behavior chain. They're contacting the reinforcer for meeting the criteria for the particular step that they're working on and all the preceding steps, okay? Okay, so just to kind of drive the point home, we're first, let's say, going to teach step 1 until mastery, then steps 1 and 2 until mastery, then steps 1, 2, and 3 until mastery, then steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 until mastery, and so on. Then up to step 5, then up to step 6, and up to step 7, and so on, okay, until you get to step 11, and then they've mastered the entire behavior chain. Another thing that we can do with forward chaining is that we can have a variation of forward chaining, which is where we don't necessarily teach in each individual skill one by one and progressively increase what step we're working on, but rather we can work on clusters of skills. Let me find my eraser. Okay. We can work on clusters of skills. So what I mean is, let's say that instead of let's say that I want to work on making, I can't delete these little ones. Okay, but that's okay. Let's say that instead of working on step 1 initially alone, okay, and then once that's mastered, I work on step 2 alone. Instead, I can work on a group of skills together or a cluster of small behavior chains together. Then once that entire cluster is mastered, then I can introduce the next cluster. So let's say that my first cluster, you can see that I'm sure you can notice that, excuse me, by the way, I'm a little bit sick, as I mentioned, that you see how these are all in darker gray? This could be our first cluster. So initially, when we start the forward chaining procedure, we'll work on all of steps 1 through 4 together. So this allows you to be a little bit more efficient. It does require more response effort on the learner's part. So this may or may not work for your learner. If you have a learner that requires more continuous reinforcement, or maybe can't attend for so long, or gets discouraged easily, then you might not want to work in clusters. But if you have a learner that is, is like sharp, they can tackle a few skills at once, they can handle it, then you can go ahead and teach in clusters. Okay, so you can work on steps 1 through 4 together. Okay, once all 4 responses or 4 behaviors in the chain are mastered, then we can go ahead and introduce steps 5 through 7. Okay, so once steps 1 through 4 are mastered and we move on to the next goal, we're going to actually be working on steps 1 through 7. So if you notice, these are steps 5, 6, and 7. I have them in a lighter gray. That would be like our second cluster. Okay, so we would then work on steps 1 through 7 together. And then finally, our third cluster is composed of steps 8 through 11. So once they master steps 1 through 7, then we'll introduce the third cluster, which will be composed of all the steps in the task analysis. So steps 1 through 11. And this, again, allows you to be a little bit more efficient with your forward chaining procedure, meaning that it won't take so long for the learner to master that particular skill. Our next chaining procedure that we're going to cover is total task chaining, or it has another term that you might hear others use, which is whole task presentation. And total task chaining is a chaining procedure in which, again, you're going to teach the skills in the naturally occurring sequence. So it is a variation of forward chaining for that reason, okay? Because we're not teaching things out of order, we're teaching things in the specific sequence that we know will occur within the natural environment or that we can naturally expect. So in the case of the chocolate milk, we're going to teach from steps 1 through 11. We're not going to mismatch any steps or do them in a different sequence or anything like that. The same sequence. So again, total task chaining is a variation of forward chaining. Except that with total task chaining, you're going to work on the entire steps, all of the steps at once. The entire task analysis at once, okay? And the learner is going to receive support with the particular steps that they need support with, and then the ones that they can be independent with, then you'll allow them to be independent with those, okay? So it's fairly straightforward, and I think, there's a ton of terms in behavior analysis. I think with the chaining procedures, as long as you can try to tie the name back into the definition, you'll be able to remember exactly what is meant by forward chaining or total task chaining, or the next one, which is backward chaining. I think that the name says it all. So just try to, think of the name and try to tie the name back into the procedure, and that way you won't have any confusion in the future. Okay, total task means that we're training the entire task. There's no other way to put it. Okay, so the trainer is going to provide assistance for any step that the learner is unable to perform independently, and then the chain is trained until the learner can perform all of the behaviors in the sequence to criterion. Once they can perform all of the skills in the task analysis independently, they've mastered that skill. So let's look at the next slide. Okay, so here again we have the same task analysis for making chocolate milk, but now we're going to look at how can we use total task chaining to teach this particular skill. So again, with total task chaining, we're going to work on all steps at the same time. So you're going to tell your client, okay, today we're going to make chocolate milk, and you're going to go step by step. They're going to see, can they go to the refrigerator? Can they open the refrigerator? Can they take out milk? Let's say that they can do steps 1 through 3, but you get to step 4, the taking off the milk cap, and they can't do it. You're going to provide support there. And then you're going to move on to step 5, and you're going to see, can they do this independently? Can they not? So get the cup in the other hand. Oh, they can't do it independently. Let me go ahead and support them. And then let's say step 6, pouring milk in the cup. Maybe they have that one down packed. They can do that one independently. So you're going to allow for that independence, and then you'll move on to the next step, and so on and so forth. You go through the entire task analysis, providing support where they need support, and backing off and allowing them to be independent in the steps that they can be independent with. And you'll do this consistently, across sessions until eventually they can complete the entire steps in the task analysis independently. And I haven't necessarily mentioned this. You saw a data sheet earlier, but every single time that you are running a task analysis, you will be collecting data on how your learner performs with each step, okay? Earlier we talked about baseline. Well, for when you're actually in treatment, okay, when you're teaching the actual skill, you're going to collect data on how they perform with that particular skill. So let's say that they independently performed steps 1. I can use an I, let's say, for steps 1 through 3. They independently performed those. Maybe they needed a partial, physical prompt for step 4. Maybe they needed a vocal prompt. I'll use VP. These are just like different ways to denote the abbreviations that you can use to denote the specific prompt types. Okay, maybe I needed a vocal prompt for step 5. Maybe pouring milk was independent. Okay, so I'm going to collect data every single time that I have this person engage in this skill. I'm going to collect data to see how they are progressing with the particular skill. So putting milk carton in the refrigerator, let's say I had to use a gestural prompt, meaning that I pointed at the refrigerator to remind them that they should put the milk carton back in the fridge. Open chocolate milk, let's say I provided a partial physical prompt here. Getting the spoon, maybe they did that independently. Okay, excuse me. Oh my goodness, something wrong with my computer. There we go. Maybe I needed a full physical prompt. Full physical for step 10, which is scooping 3 spoons of chocolate powder into the milk and then mixing milk. Maybe they did it independently. Okay, and then at the end they're gonna get their terminal reinforcer for completing the entire 11 steps. So that's one of the benefits of total task chaining, is that they are coming into contact with that natural reinforcer that's at the end, or that it could be a conditioned reinforcer, but in this case it would be the chocolate milk. They have a prepared chocolate milk that now they can drink if they really wanted to. And so that's the difference between forward chaining and total task chaining. I mean, that's one of the differences, which is that with forward chaining, they're only getting kind of that artificial reinforcement for the specific step, completing the specific step that they're working on, and they don't come into contact with that reinforcer for completing the behavior chain, whereas here they do. And usually the reinforcer for completing the behavior chain is much more potent. Okay, and it's also typically like a naturally occurring reinforcer, right? You can have, there's chocolate milk, and now they can consume that chocolate milk. That's very valuable for the learner. Okay, so now the last chaining procedure that we're going to cover is backward chaining. We'll also cover a variation of backward chaining, but let's focus on backward chaining first. So again, then the definition is in the name. With forward chaining, you're working from the beginning down, right, in the naturally occurring sequence. Well, with backward chaining, we're doing the opposite. We're actually working from the bottom up, okay, meaning that we're actually going to target the last step in the task analysis first. And then once that step is mastered, we'll add on the step that's above that one. So let's say that we were working on step 11 first. Once that's mastered, then we add 10 and 11 together. So they would have to complete steps 10 and 11 first, and then we would provide reinforcement. With backward chaining, you would complete the first few, like the first steps. So all of those steps leading up to the target behavior, you as the trainer or as a therapist would complete all of those steps, and then you would allow them the opportunity to engage in that last step, okay? So let's look through the slide. All behaviors identified in the task analysis are initially completed by the trainer, except for the final behavior in the chain. I just mentioned that. Reinforcement is delivered first when the learner performs the final behavior in the sequence at a predetermined criterion level, and then next is when the last and the next to last behaviors in the sequence are performed to criterion, which I just mentioned, right? We're going to progressively increase, we're going to progressively add in steps, but we're working from the bottom up. And then subsequently, when the last 3 behaviors are performed to criterion, so, you know, after they mastered the last 2 steps, you would add in the last 3 steps, and then, it'll be clearer on the next slide. Okay, the benefit of backwards chaining is that with backward chaining, since they're working on the last step, they're immediately coming into contact with that terminal reinforcer, or that like reinforcer that is available at the end of the sequence, right, for engaging in the full sequence. So they didn't engage in the full sequence, but they're accessing that reinforcer. So it tends to be a lot more valuable. So an example could be if you're teaching a child to tie their shoes, you would complete the entire behavior chain for them, and then all they have to do at the very end is just pull the 2 loops together. And it's the response effort is very low, and the reward is that their shoe is tied, and they get to they get to have a tied shoe, and they get to run around, do whatever it is that they were doing. Okay, this sequence proceeds backwards through the chain until all steps in the task analysis have been introduced in reverse order. So let's look through the next slide. Okay, so we're going to be using the same task analysis again for making the chocolate milk. And with backward chaining, basically what's going to happen is, let me use my marker here. You will conduct all of these steps, okay? Step 1 through 10, all of these, okay? You're going to conduct these steps for the learner. You're not going to be physically prompting them through anything. You just do it for them. And then all they have to do is practice the last skill, mix the milk and chocolate. And that's it. And once they do that, guess what? They contact their reinforcer. All right, they contact the reinforcer, the milk is done, and that's it. Once they master step 11, then we can go ahead, I'm going to use my eraser here, and now work on steps. Well, let me go back actually. What's going to happen is you're going to work on these 2 steps, steps 10 and 11, but first, you as the trainer or as the therapist or your therapist that you're supervising is going to do steps 1 through 9, okay? Excuse me. You're going to do steps 1 through 9, and then you'll have the learner practice steps 10 through 11. So now that we're teaching step 10, you're going to guide them through completing step 10. So scoop 3 spoons of chocolate powder into the milk, and then you'll allow them to do step 11, which they've already mastered, so they can probably do independently, and then they get to contact reinforcement. So now once these 2 responses or these 2 behaviors are occurring independently, you'll go ahead and you'll work on the next 3 steps. Oop, let me see. Why is this not working? I'm trying to erase here. Okay, there we go. You'll work on the next 3 steps, which are step 9 through 11, okay? And you will complete these specific skills for the learner, and they will then go ahead and do steps 9 through 11. Once that's completed, they get access to their reinforcer at the end, and then once these 3 steps are mastered together, they're occurring sequentially and independently, we can go ahead and add step 8. And then once steps 8 through 11 are mastered, we can go ahead and add step 7. And so we'll work on 7 through 11 and so on and so forth until eventually you work up your way all the way up the task analysis. And then finally you present the entire task together. And then eventually they're working on steps 1 through 11. And that would be your last step in the task analysis. Okay, so I hope this makes sense, because now we're going to talk about a variation. Let me see if I could do this. We are going to talk about a variation of this. Actually, before we talk about the variation, I touched on some of these points, but I want to make sure I don't miss any. So the first behavior the learner performs independently produces a terminal reinforcement. So I mentioned that, right? When they engage in that last response of the task analysis, or that last behavior in the task analysis, that's the one that's going to result in the terminal reinforcer, but that's the one that you're actually targeting first, which ends up benefiting the client, especially for clients that have a very difficult time, remaining focused, or they're very motivated by reinforcement, like they depend on reinforcement in order to remain engaged. Okay, so the next to last response produces the onset of a stimulus condition that reinforces that step, and then also serves as a discriminative stimulus for the last behavior. So a primary advantage of backward chaining is that the learner contacts the chain's terminal reinforcer on every instructional trial, which I demonstrated for you guys. I mentioned, when they first work on step 11, they always contact that terminal reinforcer. Then they work on 10 and 11, but they're still contacting that terminal reinforcer, and so on and so forth. As you progress, through the steps, they're still always going to contact the terminal reinforcer. So repeated reinforcement of all behaviors in the chain increases the discriminative capability of all the stimuli associated with these behaviors and the reinforcer. The main disadvantage of backward chaining is the potential passive participation of the learner in the earlier steps. So it may limit the total number of responses made during any given session. Okay, so now let's talk about that variation of backward chaining. So this variation is called backward chaining with leaps ahead. And basically what it is that we're following the same procedure as backward chaining, except that instead of, progressively and systematically increasing to the previous step in the task analysis, instead you're probing, which means that we're going to check to see which of these steps does the learner already have in the repertoire, right? Which can they do independently? And if I test it out, or if I probe a particular skill and I see, okay, this learner can do this step, then I'm not going to waste time training that specific step. I'm just going to say, okay, I tested it out. They have this step, which is, by the way, when we use the word probe, it basically means that we're testing the learner. We're just trying to see, without prompting them or anything, we're just trying to see, do they have this skill in their repertoire? And if they do, then we're not going to focus on teaching that skill because it's already in their repertoire. So we're going to move on to the next step, and we're going to test, can they engage in the following step? If they can, great, then we won't work on it. And if they can't, then we will target that step. Okay. And that's pretty much it. So tasks that the learner can perform are skipped, and the trainer leaps ahead to the next unmastered task. This decreases the total training time that's needed to learn the chain. Okay, so now let's discuss, which I've already briefly mentioned some of these things throughout the presentation. I've been sprinkling them some throughout. But now let's discuss in more detail, how do we choose a chaining method, okay? So when you are not so sure about which specific chaining method to select, there are certain things that you can do to help you decide, okay? So first, you want to make sure that you're always individualizing your TAs, your task analyses to your learners. This can help you to decide the complexity of the specific task analysis that you're using, right? If you have a very complex or long task analysis, then you might look into teaching through the clusters that I talked about with forward chaining. You might consider, maybe if it's a skill that the terminal reinforcer is very valuable to the learner, and the steps are very difficult, then you might want to do backward chaining. You can consider also what their baseline levels look like. Okay, if you conducted baseline for a learner and you see that learner has mastered a lot of the skills in the task analysis, and there's just a few that they need support on, well, then you might look at doing total task chaining, because it's not going to be so effortful, right? Total task chaining is one that, I think it's great because you're teaching things in the natural sequence. You're giving them the opportunity to engage in the entire sequence of behaviors. However, if it's a difficult chain of behaviors to that, like, it's not that it's difficult for you, but that it's difficult for the learner. Maybe it's high response effort for the learner. If they can't engage in any of those skills already, and then you're asking them to engage in this really long, complex sequence of behaviors, and they don't have anything in their repertoire, you're probably not going to get good results from your learner. You might lose them, meaning that they might not be attending anymore, they might engage in problem behavior, etc. But if they already have a lot of those behaviors in their repertoire during baseline, then you could probably do total task chaining, because they're more likely to contact reinforcement for those steps that they can independently complete, and they'll be able to more quickly access that terminal reinforcer for completing the behavior chain. Now, you also can consider, your learner. If you have been working with that client for a long time, and you know what their history is like, and you know that there's a particular chaining procedure that they perform best with, you can go ahead and use that chaining procedure. If you know that your client engages in problem behavior, right? They have like task avoidance they engage in task avoidance. Then backward chaining is probably the best option, so that they can contact that reinforcement very quickly, and they're accessing the terminal reinforcer, which is usually very valuable. Otherwise, you can use a procedure like forward chaining, which also is minimizing the response effort for the client, and then they're able to receive reinforcement pretty immediately. So it really is dependent on your learner, and if they have some exposure to these different chaining procedures, then that can help guide your decision-making process. If they don't, well, then you can just try out a specific procedure and see how they do with that procedure. It's, that trial and error format. If they're not doing very well with a specific procedure, then you can always modify your intervention. Okay, and now to finish off our presentation on behavior chains, we're going to talk about the factors that might affect the performance of your learner when they are completing behavior chains. So the first factor that could be contributing to not so great performance with your behavior chain is that your task analysis was not developed all that well, meaning that maybe your learner, maybe a specific step was missing in the sequence, or maybe there's something that you missed or that you can modify to make it a little bit more digestible for your learner, or to make it easier for your learner to know exactly what you're trying to teach them. So learning the chain will be more difficult if the elements that make up the chain are not sequenced appropriately. Earlier, actually, a good example for this is the example that I gave earlier about the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So you can come up with a task analysis of how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And oftentimes when we've asked people to engage in a task analysis or create a task analysis for creating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, they typically will miss the very first step, which is to grab the bread and open the bread. And so you will have certain steps that your learner won't be able to follow, okay? So this is what I mean. So next, the learning the chain is going to be more difficult if the corresponding discriminative stimulus is not identified for each response. So what exactly are we expecting to signal what behavior we want that client to engage in, right? We have to make sure that we're being meticulous when we are designing our steps, because one step should be signaling what behavior they're supposed to engage in next. And then once they engage in that behavior, that next behavior is going to serve as the SD for the next behavior. So have we set up our steps appropriately? Are those discriminative stimuli very clear when we are having the learner engage in the behavior? Because if we don't have very clear SDs, then the next behavior in the chain is not going to be signaled. I think a good example of this is, this has happened to me often, where I'm trying to follow a recipe for dinner. Let's say I'm cooking something and I'll go online and I'll look up a recipe, and sometimes some recipes are very detailed and they're very clear, and then other times I'll follow a recipe and there's like a missing step, and so I'm halfway through the recipe and I'm almost stuck because that SD was missing for the following behavior. There was a missing step or a missing link, and so I'm not sure now how to proceed into the next step. I don't know what follows, what behavior follows. So a recipe is an example of a task analysis. And we can have great task analyses, or we can have very poorly written task analyses where there are steps that are missing. Okay. 2 key points when attempting to develop a task analysis: planning must occur before training, and then begin training with the expectation that adjustments or the use of more intrusive prompts may be needed. I've mentioned this throughout the presentation. You can come up with a wonderful, this applies to anything in behavior analysis. You can come up with a wonderful treatment plan that looks great in writing, but when you put it into practice in the real world, you will probably have to make modifications to it, and you will have to tailor your intervention to your learner, okay? And then also, this point mentions that you're going to have to use more intrusive prompts sometimes, and that's true. You just want to meet your learner where they are at, right? If your learner needs support, provide that support, and if they don't need the support, then back off and allow them to be independent. Okay. Another factor that's going to affect the performance of our behavior chains are going to be the length and the complexity of the chain. I've also kind of mentioned this. So longer or more complex behavior chains will take more time to learn than shorter or less complex ones. And then usually when we do a lengthy or complex behavior chain, then we want to consider those other methods that are going to help keep our learners more engaged and are going to allow them to access reinforcement more quickly, so that forward chaining or that backward chaining procedure might be better options. Okay, and then of course, with anything in behavior analysis, we always want to consider the schedule of reinforcement, because we want to make sure that whatever skill we're teaching to that learner is receiving adequate reinforcement to support those behaviors. Okay, if you're not producing or providing reinforcement and on a consistent basis, you're not providing not just on a consistent basis, but high quality reinforcement, or reinforcement that's enough to maintain that behavior, then the behavior might stop occurring altogether. Okay, so a chain can be maintained if an appropriate schedule of reinforcement is used. And then the number of responses in a chain may need to be considered when defining the schedule of reinforcement. Okay, another factor that could affect the performance of behavior chains are stimulus variations. So if possible, introduce all possible variations of the discriminative stimulus that the learner will encounter. This is something that we call in behavior analysis, which it's called multiple exemplar training, right? You want to, as much as possible, include a variety of stimuli so that your learner is able to generalize to different stimuli in the environment. They can generalize their behavior across different stimuli. A perfect example of this is when you're working on washing your hands. If you only work, let's say that you only work on teaching a client to wash their hands with a bar of soap, great, they will master that skill with the bar of soap. But if you don't introduce any variety, any different stimuli, guess what's going to happen when they go to a restaurant and they don't see a bar of soap there, and instead they see an automatic dispenser of soap, or they see the one where you have to push down? Do you think that your learner's going to know how to do that? No. Well, maybe they automatically generalize to those particular stimuli, but usually we have to program for generalization, meaning that we have to incorporate multiple exemplars in our training, so that that learner is more likely to generalize to different stimuli, to different environments, to whatever it might be. Okay, so what this would look like in training is when you're training that learner to wash their hands, you can have a bar of soap, or you can have, a soap that needs to be pumped. You can have foam soap. You can have just incorporate different types of soap. You can also incorporate different types of faucets, because we all know faucets can be distinctly different. I went to a house. This is just a personal example. I went to a house. I actually ended up buying the same faucet for my house, but I went to a house where they had a specific bird faucet. And when I got to the house, I was trying to wash my hands. I had no idea how to open the faucet. I was pulling on the wings of the bird. I was pulling on the head of the bird, and I couldn't figure out. I thought I was going to break the faucet because I couldn't figure out how to open it. And then I had to open the door and actually ask, how do I open this faucet? And there was a tiny little crank at the back that you push back on, and it opens, or it turns on the water. I had no idea. So this is why, obviously this is a very unique stimulus that you can't possibly expect to train someone across all the different stimuli, but as much as possible, we want to increase variation so that that person is more likely to be successful when they come into contact with the different stimuli. Thankfully, I had the skill to be able to advocate for myself, which is why I always tell you guys, you want to teach advocacy skills to your clients in combination with any program. Okay, you can have a task analysis and at the same time be teaching advocacy skills, meaning that you're teaching your learner to ask for help, or to say, I'm not sure how to do this, or this is too tight, can you please, open this cap for me, or whatever it might be. Okay, this is, you're going to hear me say the same thing throughout this entire course. You can teach advocacy skills along with this, so that if they do come across a particular stimulus that they're not sure how to use, then they can request help or support with that particular step in the behavior chain. Okay, and then lastly, another factor that would affect the performance of the behavior chain is response variation. So when stimulus variations occur, response variation must also occur to produce the same effect. So this goes hand in hand with what I just mentioned. I didn't know how to open the faucet. It was a different stimulus and it required a different response. The same with the soap dispensers. Each soap dispenser is going to require a different response. So I just need to make sure that as much as possible, I'm exposing my client to different stimuli. I'm not going to be able to account for all the different stimuli, and that's okay. Well, I think this is the last slide for this lecture, so I hope that this helps you with the behavior chaining procedures, and I'll see you for the next lecture.